Hi, poets. Welcome to Poet. I'm Radha Marcum, and today I have the pleasure of talking to Emily Pérez, author of What Flies Want. Before I introduce you to Emily, I'd like to invite you to become a subscriber of Poet to Poet if you aren't already. Just go to poettopoet.substack.com and subscribe for free. In it, you'll find interviews like this one, plus helpful ideas on writing and publishing books of poetry. So again, today I am so thrilled to introduce you to Emily Pérez. Emily is the author of What Flies Want, which is the winner of the Iowa Prize for Poetry, and the co-editor of The Long Devotion, Poets Writing Motherhood. A Canto Mundo Fellow and Ledbury critic, her work can be found in OK Donkey, D. Reginald, Cosmonauts Avenue, Kenyon Review, Los Angeles Review of Books, and The Rumpus. A high school teacher, she lives in Denver with her family. So Emily, welcome to Poet.
Thanks so much, Radha. I'm excited to be here.
So I thought we'd start with the book's title. So the title's often one of the last elements to be finalized in a manuscript. But I'm curious, did you have a working title or multiple working titles? How did you arrive at this wonderful title, What Flies Want? And yeah, just any advice for poets on what makes an effective book title?
Sure. So this is maybe fourth, the maybe third or fourth title for this manuscript. In the waves in which I sent it out, I think there were three different titles, and there was probably a title before that, before I started sending it out. And the way I arrived at this title, this is actually a great question, because it hits on a number of things about pulling together the manuscript. I'm not great at pulling together a manuscript, and ordering is something I really struggle with. And at the AWP, right when the world was shutting down, in 2020, I ran into a friend of mine, David Campos, who is a poet in Fresno. And he and I were just having a drink, and I was telling him about this issue I have with ordering things, and he said, "Oh, I'm happy to help you with that." And what he talked to me about then, and then after quarantine, we met on Zoom and talked more about it. But what he talked to me about was thinking about genre and thinking of your poetry manuscript as having a genre, and then using the rules of genre to help order your manuscript. And so after he read my working manuscript, he said, "Your genre is horror. And so you need to find a title that speaks to that genre." And so he looked through, like, what are the titles you already have in here that feel like they're kind of in that vein. And so I have a poem in the collection called What Flies Want Is Not. And he is the one who identified What Flies Want as a possible title for the manuscript. And as soon as he had some other options as well, which I can't remember at this point, but as soon as he said that, I was like, oh yeah, that works, on so many levels. Like, just it works with several of the themes in the book, of this idea of like what's like just spoiled or just past, the things that flies are interested in, that I'm, trying to avoid or trying to get away from.
Mm, that's fascinating. So genre, so horror.
Yeah.
That's
Yes.
fascinating.
Horror.
I had
Yes.
never heard that approach to figuring out what the manuscript wants as far as that structure. That's really
I
interesting.
thought it was brilliant. He said he recommended two, um, books on screenplays, that because screenwriters have to think in a very structured way, just thinking about like where the different parts of a screenplay occur, and then translating your ideas about poetry into that. Where do you introduce the characters? Where do you introduce the conflict? All of that.
That's fascinating. I love it. Um, so how many years did you take to write the poems that became this book? Where did it start?
So my first full-length collection, House of Sugar, House of Stone, which is also sort of a horror. Well, it's a fairy tale, like a dark fairy tale, which I think the title also reflects that. That book was published in 2016, and I learned that it would be published in 2015. And I had heard from, many people who had been publishing much longer than I, that it's hard to write a second book. And so I made a commitment in 2015 to start, like, just to start writing a bunch of new stuff because I didn't want to have the book come out in 2016 and then to be asking myself, okay, what do I do now? Like, I wanted to kind of get a head start and have a sense of direction so that when the book came out, I was already writing something new. So the earliest poems in that book are from 2015, and I was writing it probably up through about 2019. All of the poems are pre-pandemic poems. And I think I started sending it out in its earliest versions in about 2019. So it was about 4 years of writing and then another 2+ years of submitting. And in that time, all kinds of rearranging and revising and everything. But I'd say the bulk of it was done um, in 2019.
Mhm. Great. Yeah, I mean, the more I talk to poets, the more, and having been around the publishing space for a good while now, you see, my students will come in thinking, oh, well, I can do this in a few years, right? I can just start this project and it'll come to fruition. Or even, the MFA program is
Yeah.
centered around, 2, maybe 3 years intensive work. And then I think a lot of people have that expectation, I should have a book by now. Uh,
Yeah.
and that's, often unrealistic.
Mhm.
Even for, a second book, it takes some years. So to me, 4 to 5 to 6 years, that's actually a pretty quick development time, seems
I
to
feel
me.
that way too. My first book took 10 years, so 6 years feels relatively speedy by comparison. Yeah.
So would you like to read a poem for us, maybe Before I Learned to Be a Girl?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Um, yeah, and I really love I love this poem in part for its just a little bit of backstory on it. I've attended the Community of Writers retreat twice, and for that retreat on the poetry side, you have to produce a new poem for every day, and so there's always this moment of like, oh, can I do it? Is it possible? Can I write something new for tomorrow? And I wrote this poem there, and so it was one of those like nothing is gonna happen, and then something happened. So, um, before I learned to be a girl, I used to howl around the eaves, a wind unwound. I used to bridle like a groom atop a stallion, cowing pirates into spilling bullion. Never buckled like a shoe, but shoed the shorn beyond the barn, so I could hoard the golden fleece. I fleeced the flock, a picky phoenix culling coppers from their pockets. I pockmarked concrete castles with a fist. I frisked the guards and gunmen. I manned the gunwale, gunned down the siren song until I heard my sternum thrum, wound my way around the capes and through canals, threading narrow courses like a needle, needling all my naysayers and needing nothing but my own fine fire.
It's gorgeous. I love hearing it. I mean, it's just always such a treat to hear the poem loud. Um, yeah, it's beautiful.
Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about the maybe thematic content of the book. So it covers a lot of territory, literally and metaphorically. So I'm going to read a little bit of the book jacket copy because I think it will help orient people to what we're going to talk about next. So Um, the book jacket says the speaker who grew up in a bicultural family on the US Mexico border learns she must play a role in a culture that prizes whiteness, patriarchy, and chauvinism. As an adult, she oscillates between performed confidence and obedience. As a wife, she bristles against the expectations of emotional labor. As a mother, she attempts to direct her white male children away from the toxic power they are positioned to inherit, only to find how deeply she is also implicated in these systems. Wow. So, so without trying to, swallow and digest all of that, for the reader, because I think, it's for the reader to find all of this in the poems, but I'm curious, how does poetry address these themes in ways that other genres maybe can't?
I think, I mean, I think that other genres can address these themes, but what I think is great about poetry is that a book, um, or really, I guess about poems and then putting poems together in a book is their length and that they are both self-contained and they're interconnected, and so that a book of poetry becomes like a collage or like a mosaic where you may see something that's here and then it's echoed here and then it's built upon here, and so there's these threads running through. And so maybe unlike a novel where you're developing a character who has these things coming in and out of their life, um, in a book of poetry, you can have these various ideas that are starting to bump up against each other and come together. And you just get these little tastes of them. And then over the course of a book, they build an argument. So I think in that sense, poetry is kind of nimble, like it can address a lot of issues. Maybe more economically than some other genres can.
Mm-hmm. And just out of curiosity, and I have a feeling I probably can guess what you might say to this question, but because I think it's one that students have in their minds around this idea of writing a book. Did you start with these themes in mind, or did they rise out of the writing of these poems?
So there are a couple of things happening at once. So in I'm forgetting what year, maybe in 2018, um, a, a new press, a chapbook press, asked me if I had a chapbook because they're looking for material to publish. And I didn't, but I said I did. And so I had to find like 30 pages on something. And so I looked back at what I had at that point and found that I had a whole arc on being a girl in a patriarchy. And so I put together a chapbook, and that got published at the end of 2019. It's called Made and Unmade. And once I had the chapbook, I felt like that's the center of whatever comes next. Um, so the chapbook gave me an anchor point or gave me kind of a spine on which to think about, well, what else goes here? Is this a whole book on this topic, or is there what else can be at play here? And I had a couple of other themes in the chapbook that didn't make it into this book, like a lot about bodies and beauty, and I took that out, and that'll maybe be in the next thing. um, but there was a lot about gender and about forming gender identity and gender roles. And so I kept that because meanwhile, I'm a mother of two, now they're 9 and 11, but of two kids. And, and I'm watching them and very complicit in their growing up and the things that they're learning about their genders, and then also the way they're learning about gender relations and about violence. And so I was writing poems about those things as well. And then I saw how these things were kind of coming together. That I was writing about systems of power, so about patriarchy, masculinity, whiteness, both as they related in my life growing up as a girl and then in my kids' lives growing up. So then I kind of made the bookends of the book, the opening section and the closing section, more about more from a perspective of a mother raising male identified children, and also white identified children, and how are those children poised to inherit these things, and how am I either guiding them into that or guiding them away from it.
Mhm. Well, very successful in the
Thanks.
poems in doing that. Um, so maybe let's hear another poem,
Okay.
Your Mood.
All right. Okay. This is a prose poem called Your Mood. Your mood is a big balloon that presses the furniture from the room. Your mood has a tailing string that snaps at ankles, angling. Your mood rankles when the spotlight's off, itches when my hands are busy, topples boxes in the basement. I have tried to hold your mood, but like an oiled piglet, it squirms free. I bring ice to soothe its mumpsy cheeks. When I punch your mood, I reactivate the yeast. Your mood casts a rain shadow, which I've learned is a place that's neither dark nor feels the rain. Two types of comfort I now miss. Your mood is silent in a crowd. Under skin, it thunder speaks.
There's they're so rich, these poems. I mean, just the layering of image and sensory detail, um, under the heading of something like Your Mood, which I love this idea of the horror genre, because it feels like there is something
Mhm.
ominous, even in,
Yes.
yeah.
There's one review of my book published by a journal called Coffin Dance, which I didn't even know existed until they wrote this review, and they review horror. And I was like, I love that this journal found my book. And one thing the reviewer says is, like, there's this tension, like, what's gonna happen, like, what's the thing that's going to happen. And I definitely wanted to build that in the book.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's so felt, these themes that we're talking about, they're big themes, and yet there's never once in the book that I feel this writer has written a book about this theme.
Oh, right.
You know,
Yeah. Well,
it's
good.
just very embodied, in all senses of that term. Um, so, so I want to talk a little bit about form, because you have a unique use of um, certain elements, and
Mhm.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense to use different forms throughout the book, because you're taking us through different scenes and different types of psychologies that relate to the themes of the book. So, for example, I noticed you use a slash mark in place of periods or commas, and lineated in different ways, right? So, um, but that use of the slash mark comes back, almost like a refrain in itself. So I was just curious, you don't have to necessarily talk about the slash mark, but how did you think about form
Mhm.
um, in relation to the content of the poems? And does that come in early for you, or is it something that's later?
That's a really great question, and it's a bit of a mystery to myself. I, so the way I write or the way I compose, I just write uh, prose in my journals. So I rarely write in lines, and it's only when I'm going back to the material in my journals that I'm trying to figure out, like, okay, is there a poem in here somewhere? And then when I'm rewriting material and adding on to it, that's when I start to play with line breaks. And I'd say almost everything starts just as a block of prose, and then almost everything, the next step is just a continuous stanza form. like
Mhm.
no breaks, no stanza breaks. And and then it takes me a really long time to let the form evolve after that. It's usually not obvious to me at the beginning what something's going to become. And um, some of these poems have gone through several stages, and some have maybe gone through like two phases before they sort of found their form, but it's not a quick process. And
Mhm.
part of it is through reading it out loud and hearing where I want uh, a surprise to be, the surprise of the line break or the tension of the stanza break that carries over, kind of the suspense that can be created in the white space of a stanza break. So reading out loud helps guide that. And I do think the virgule, the slash mark, allows for kind of an in-between space of a line break, but also a running together of ideas. And so it creates a certain kind of pace that I like. Or if it's actually at the end of a line break and there's white space after it, I think it creates an even harder stop before you go into the next line. Um, so some of it is just living with the poems for a while, reading them out loud, seeing how they talk and like where those spaces should come in and where those breaks should come in. And then the other part of it is the manuscript as a whole. So once I have kind of a rough order, poems together, I also want variety in how they look and feel. That I just if it's like seven poems in a row that are all shaped the same way, to me that feels too static. And so I want to do something to disrupt the the look of them on the page, but also just the way you feel when you look at them, and then just the way they feel in your mind and body as you're reading them. So some of that is also in relation to the poem that comes before and the poem that comes after. What should this one look like?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I talked to Cyrus Cassels recently about his new book, and it's all couplets. It's very, very sustained, throughout the book. And, so it's just really interesting to hear different strategies
Mm-hmm.
around material. And I don't know, like, I'm not sure what kind of genre his genre would be, but maybe it's one that has more of a steady flow and less of that,
Yeah.
element of
And
tension or surprise.
and I admire a poet who can do that, like a poet who can write all in sonnets or a poet who can write, all in couplets, and kind of keep a certain momentum going in that way. And I feel like there's enough unevenness in the kind of tones I'm creating that I want to make it even more uneven.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it's very effective. So
Thanks.
I'm glad I'm glad that was your strategy. Um, so would you like to read one more poem in closing? Maybe I have plenty.
Sure. This is the last poem in the book. I have plenty. I have a house full of suns. I have a home full of swords. I have real armor and fake vulnerability. I have my work cut out and my art cut out, and my secret cut out heart in the shape of a string of hand clasped paper dolls folded over each other, waiting. I have pleasures, outright admiration for words. I have sunlight dappling an unshakable sense of my own self worth that sprang from my father's selfishness, my mother's bow down. I have a dearth of role models, but love and belief in my boundaries, inviolable. My voice can be powerful. I have things to unlearn. I have wealth unearned. I have privilege to spare. I have breathable air, not sure for how long, given how I contribute to destruction of earth. I have love for all people, except I have foes. I have questions. I have doubts in the reach of my arms, in my self righteousness. I have a body I alternately praise and despise. Do I see through my needs? Am I desiring or just aiming as always to please? Do I find myself requiring? No, I have plenty.
Beautiful.
Thanks.
So in closing, how can people find you? How would you like to be found?
They can find me on Twitter at Emily the Perez, so EmilYThePerez. They can find me on Instagram at a variation on that, the M Perez, TheEmPerez. They can find me at my website. It's www.emilyperez.org. I have two of the most common names in the world, so no .com for me. And those are probably the main ways.
Great, wonderful. And everyone go buy the book. And what's the best way to buy the book?
Really anywhere. It's on Bookshop. It's on the University of Iowa Press website. It's on Amazon. I hope someday it'll be in the library. I haven't looked yet whether it's in my public library. But it's yeah, anywhere. It's at Barnes and Noble. Anywhere you buy books, you should be able to get it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Emily. It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks, Radha. I really enjoyed this.